Hello everyone, today we talk about the ethnogenetic origins of the Avar people, especially the Pannonian Avars, but not only. I already made a video about the latter that I titled for our Migration Era series, this video being also part of it, a Turco-Mongol people, which turns out to be in fact the case, at least as the original one that conquered the Pannonian basin. I also realized that I haven't made so much Hungarian and pre-Hungarian history, so probably will make more, especially about the region as a whole across the entire Middle Ages. Today's topic is a relatively novel, meaning that I never really made a video about ethnogenetics to some sort of level of depth. So I'm not a specialist in genetics, I'm just a medievalist, but you know that the task of a historian is to pick sort of the best information out there. Here we'll properly cite the authors of these researches that are plentiful as a whole. Like, we understand, of course, more or less well what kind of peoples we're dealing with. There are, of course, some limits to ethnogenetic research for this sort of times and places in general, but together with documentary evidence, and so historiography, we know fairly well the entire picture. We will hopefully talk more about the Avars proper, their warfare, etc. I've already made, I think, several videos, if not entirely about them, that accounts for just a few of those, at least, you know, presenting their general interaction in Central Europe, in the Balkans, in Italy, in Germany. If anything, we haven't talked so much about the Pontic Steppe, so this massive dimension at some point the Khaganate took. But that's not essentially what, or exclusively what we're discussing today. So the ethnogenetic origins of the Avars as a nomadic confederation that established the Kaganate in the base, in fact, in the Carpathian basin from 567-68 until its dissolution around 822, traced back first to the turbulent dynamics of central Eurasian steppe polities in the mid-6th century. Notice the chronology that we're naturally familiar with. 567, especially 568, the latter being the moment the Lombards moved from the Pannonian basin to northern Italy, the Avars having brokered a deal with them and having helped them actually in basically sharing influence over the Gepidic people, part of which was deported to the Italian peninsula by their fellow Germans, and the other remaining instead into the Carpathian basin in Transylvania under the Avars, and essentially there were refugees, Byzantine Empire, etc. But if anything, we know relatively less for the eastern half of of Europe than the western one. Again, we will come back on this kind of topics that especially revolve around the shepherding capacity of peoples like the Avars and their kin, just by steppe lordship lifestyle and authority to guide, to make leverage, in fact, on these more fragmented, subjected populations, to back their military expeditions, including, for example, the attempted siege of Constantinople, together with the Persians. There are all some critical moments that actually also match the high point of Avaric power that, frankly, declined quite steadily. These systems, at least as in their original steppe fashion, could probably not survive in the longer run. The beginning of the 9th century witnesses the Carolingian conquest of the Avars along the Danube that gets cleared, temporarily reunites essentially the Western Slavs with the Yugoslavs before the arrival of the Magyars later, just after a few generations in the same region that had been occupied by the Huns before. So there is a great continuum in that sense, and the Pannonian Basin was also the collection point of different times in history of all those peoples that were to make the leap, and especially enter into Italy. It had been the case for the Lombards, as we've seen. It had been the same for the Ostrogoths. Even the Indo-Europeans back in the day had basically stationed in what would become Pannonia before entering the peninsula. Here, however, we witness to that, in fact, the Turkic phase of steppe migrations that does not go pretty far, as also evidenced by Attila. These peoples did not have a capacity to fundamentally engineer and hegemonize the local social-cultural fabric, and especially the political international landscape, to not just to last very long, but to be compatible with civilization. This is a very important topic, especially for, again, this Hungarian, pre-Hungarian history, because the region would be importantly affected. Right, it's also a quite environmentally composite region, partly allowing, in fact, for the installation and the survival of some steppe lifestyle. All right, because this is in great part the westernmost part of the Eurasian steppes. Naturally, there is also the chapter of the Eastern Eurasia, and we will partly get there today, if anything, because as we already know, a big spoiler, of course, the Avars came as a bit as all basically the Turks and the Mongols as they developed as such, from a very narrow confine of the Eastern Asian steppes, right? The Indo-Europeans in the previous millennia, having properly confined these people in a ghetto situation, even by steppe standards, lording over a large amount of population. And there is evidence, as we've seen also in a recent video about the relatively recent video about the Gök Turks, the Kyrgyz, it's another group that some of these peoples may have as well been initially in their elite, in their original leadership, Indo-European. In fact, the Kyrgyzs are described, for example, having a reddish beard, still later in the Middle Ages, so in times in which the Turco-Mongols essentially had taken over the Eurasian steppes, but obviously had not erased the local demographics. That's also another topic. But as ethnogenetics tells us, we're dealing chiefly, in the case of the Avars, that were a significantly powerful people by migration era standards, also by military standards. The Byzantines really considered them the only actually competent barbarian from a military point of view. And I, in fact, made some videos about the Strategicon, the later Tactica, that are basically just a re-edition of the work by Sel de Maurice, the Strategicon, and Leo the Wise, a couple of centuries later, to look at how they fundamentally fought, which was very similar, however, to most Asiatic hordes in this period. While it is true, in fact, that there are actual differences between these various waves that arrive, that are also not generally improving the overall quality of the thing. If not, maybe the Avars over the Huns, they figure well, but later on, things would get ever more diluted, as these migrations also entailed some kind of exhaustion. But that's another topic. So we will also be talking about politics that we haven't quite covered in depth. When we're talking the migration era, we realize also that a lot was going on, in fact, in terms of a rise and fall of empires in the steppes. The Avar migration is connected with the collapse of the Rouran Khaganate, centered in what is now Mongolia, geographically speaking, following its defeat by the emergent first Turkic Khaganate under Bumin Khagan, were around 552 AD. So we are basically at the end of the Justinian reconquest. It's all in relatively close times to eventually the same arrival of the Avars in Europe. Chinese sources, including the Weishu and Beishi, record that the late antique Proto-Mongol Ruran, ruled by Khagans and known to steppe neighbors possibly as Avars themselves initially, suffered heavy losses. At a point, many were killed, while survivors fled eastward toward Korea. As we've seen also in some videos about the Far East, including Japan, that, for example, display much more steppe influence than the same China, interestingly enough, because these knights of the steppes would air to to pretty far away places, even in relatively unchecked way, and of course integrated also in local warfare. Or speaking about the remnants of the Rurans, integrated into the Western Way state. A faction of these people, however, surviving again this turbulent clashes with neighbors, migrated westward, initially reaching the western fringes of central Eurasia, near the Aral Sea region, where they coalesced with other displaced groups into essentially a multi-ethnic alliance, as it was typical of the steppes. Remember, there is still remainders of the Indo-European confederacies. It's a pretty turbulent moment. The Turks have already passed there, thinking about the Huns, but a lot of them contain, in fact, these previous groups, and things would stay that way for a long time. This westward movement was precipitated by, in fact, the same expansion of the Turks as a whole, who subdued not only the Rouran, that, remember, were essentially proto-Mongolic, as far as we understand, but also the Hephthalites, that is to say, the white Huns, the ones who bordered the Sasanians in Persia, as opposed to the black ones that were the ones that we took in Europe, and the Turkic Tila tribes in subsequent campaigns under Mukan Kagan around 560-565. Now, the fleeing Rouran corps, likely comprising elite warriors and their kin, absorbed elements of the War, also rendered as Var, spelled in different ways, a tribe of obscure linguistic affiliation, but possibly speaking an Iranian or mixed dialect. So, again, partly Indo-European. And the Xionites, Chionitai or Xion, depending on the people that was documenting them, that were Iranian and or Turkic-speaking nomads previously allied with the Hephthalites. All right, so different satellite states that basically switched gravitational sphere basically around these more compact, more performing peoples, because also the broken parts could be quite warlike by the standards of some more fringe of the steppe people that had maybe more gentrified, had in fact not remained at the center of steppe politics, and had been tendentially been also more sedentarizing, importantly enough. This was not much of a time of sedentarization. There is a great reactivation of probably a nomadic culture during the migration era, but still, right, at the borderlands with the great civilizations, that's what normally happened. Also because all what these peoples wanted was essentially good land, right? And so land that, unlike the steppe one, could also yield more in terms of surplus, and therefore significantly alter at the root the nature of the nomadic lifestyle. It's not like they were rationalizing that, but it was part of a broader adaptative capacity. That's also what happened, I don't know, to the same Indo-Europeans and beyond. The resulting confederation of these amalgamation was the acquired prestigious ethnonym Avar, which evoked the formidable reputation of the true Avars that were presumably the eastern Ruran remnants still under loose Turkic suzerainty at that point, as a strategic ploy to intimidate encountered foes during their migration. Avar, etymologically speaking, is connected with the concept of a wanderer, but in a sort of providential, universally divine sense, right? You could see it from a senator perspective, more like with a negative bias of nomad, migrant, wanderer, but in their view was like being errant knights and leaders capable of projecting their control over far away places, guided by heaven in the process, and lording over these peoples, which is also an attitude that in Europe they would show with incredible brutality, but also governmental capacity. By the early 60s of the 6th century, this alliance had traversed the Pontic-Caspian steppes, subjugating or incorporating fragmented Turkic-speaking tribes such as the Sabirs, the Onogurs, the Utigurs, the Kutrugurs, and Barsils, who had filled the power vacuum left by the Hans collapse after 453. Naturally, there were Hans scattered. Again, the political identity, the ethnic identity here is very politically intended, as we have just seen for also this remnant of the Avars, right? So we're basically in the Russian Ukrainian steppes. The Avars would, as we'll see now, make the leap forward, crossing to Carpathian basin and settling at the frontier of the Great Western Empire. The Augur groups that we have just mentioned, often collectively termed Bulgars, at least in Byzantine sources, Bulgaro and et similia, provided numerical strength and local knowledge, but the Avar leadership retained inner Asian institutional hallmarks, right? That is the Kagan title, the hierarchical clan structures, and a patrilineal elite endogamy that preserved their distinct identities. We will see now this is quite important ethnogenetically speaking, because of course the elite burials are the most documentable, and so that tells us a lot about who was in charge in the Avar Kaganate in Europe. While we haven't made too many videos about these Turkic groups, war bands at the times, but also bigger tribes in function, especially now in the Byzantine international policy, not just diplomacy, but the actual recruitment in the imperial army. We've seen them, for example, some Huns that were likely former prisoners of war, forcibly enlisted by the Byzantines for the Belisarian campaign in Africa, for example, against the Vandals. Is one of those, exactly one of those groups. We should talk more about sort of how these nomadic peoples sort of formed and or composed, etc. Here we are mostly focusing on other, on the complexive, let's say, picture of our identity, right? But there is a pattern normally, and you understand, as we have explained, because I made entire series about properly Eurasian steppes warfare, etc. Like steppes peoples are maybe fierce and brutal, and in fact habituated to live in a nightmarish scenario that definitely impressed the centuries, the civilization, for their bloodthirstiness and exotic appearance. But at the end of the day, they weren't really the stronger powers, right? Especially at this time in history, and things would essentially stay in that way across the ages. Now, the migration's final push into the Carpathian basin exploited mostly the power shift following the Lombard destruction of the Gepidic kingdom in 567 along the Tisza River. We should point out that these early Avars weren't the formidable might that of the time of the later siege of Constantinople in 626, together with the Persians and the Slavs, etc. As they were all fragmented. So also the unfortunately, we don't know too much about how things unfolded. At some point we can make more in-depth videos, especially gathering information from the Byzantine side, all the various groups of refugees that flocked to the Constantinopolitan court, different rulers of different kinds. We've seen it even with the Heruli, for example, in another migration era people's series. Again, so we will at some point grow more details about the stuff, including the Proto-Slavs, for example, that were there all along. Nobody ever talks about including ourselves here, but that really deserves instead as a topic. It's very fascinating. So we also documented Gepidic history, Lombard history. We know how this stuff happened, and the Longobards and the Avars, to make the long story short, jointly destroyed this Germanic kingdom. After different battles, the Longobards, having settled Pannonia since the mid-6th century amid remnants of Roman provincials, Sarmatians, these were all the Iranians that had fled the steppes and scattered also as far as Portugal, but mostly concentrating among these essentially Elbe Germans or East Germans. Depending on the Longobards were Elbe Germans, the Gepids were East, but let's say they were also pretty similar with one another. And Ostrogoths, in fact, as well, then evacuated to Italy in 568. It's often said that the Avars displaced these large Longobards, but it's likely that these were already well, let's say, prepared to move to Italy, also because it also seems that the Byzantines themselves had actually called them into the peninsula, contrary to the notion that the Longobards simply invaded it. It de facto happened like that, but it's not because the Byzantines did not want it or did not greenlight it in the moment. There is no explicit evidence for this, but when you realize that the Byzantines did not move a finger with their field armies and everything flowed normally in Constantinople for years, while the Longobards were settling in the peninsula, you realize that that was the case. Because otherwise, again, the Byzantines had backed alternately the Longobards, the Gepids, and so on. We will, again, talk more about that again. The Avars had profited of this. There was a power vacuum. Essentially, Pannonia, as we've seen, had areas of steppe. Like Italy was much better for the Longobards, that as Germans were already enough civilized, even though they were not among the most Romanized Germans, for sure. Whereas the Avars could have never practically come to lord over a civilized country, and they preferred the steppes from which they could launch raids, right? Which will be relatively mostly directed against the Byzantine Empire. Later, they harassed the Longobards, the Merovingians, but never for conquest. It was mostly like a looting thing. I mean, the Magyars did much worse later on in the same way. So this region, by the way, had partially been Roman, because the Danube was mostly the limit of Romanization, except for the fact that Pannonia was also not a particularly developed place in general. It had always been a militarized frontier. The only rich area along the Danube was actually Moesia, that at this point had mostly been occupied by the Gepids, and in fact the same Avars would try to hegemonize it, but the Byzantines also wanted to maintain control over those, Singidunum, Viminatum, etc. And so basically urban decay was very advanced. It had never been this enormous thing to begin with. There were sparse latent settlements in Pannonia, and mixed Germanic Sarmatian populations, plus already an incipient Slavic presence that did not have much political cohesion, right? We made some videos explaining this, for example, the one on the Pannonian Slavs. In general, outside of the empire, it was never like a particularly solid political development, right? Also after the fall of the western half. So everything that basically flows, civilizationally speaking, in the West is the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, as essentially the continuation of the western part of the Roman Empire. We made really lots of videos on this topic. The Avars remained wilder, and they further widened the region, because being invaded by Central Asian nomads is not exactly the best way to improve local conditions. There can be, admittedly, some form of compaction. At the moment, you can be screened from, further migrations with something like that. But aside from the fact that the Avars also beautifully kill each other throughout their history, and in fact, we know that their territory was a colander. I mean, the Slavs kept passing through, even as significant groups. Think about the Serbs. That allegedly in the beginning of the 7th century literally passed through this territory, accomplice yet another Avar civil war. It's really something really very different from a political territorial state in a civilized sense. It's their warlikeness, the fact that they basically after a settlement find the strengths and the wisdom of politically uniting, which is by far the most important thing from a military point of view, that will pose threats like the ones of Constantinople 626. Now, led by Kagan Bayan, the Avars overrun the Pannonian basin, allying briefly with Constantinople initially against steppe rivals that kept arriving from the east, right, including the peoples that were technically already our subjects, right, because in theory the notion is that this Avar Kaganate did not really have an eastern frontier, like it arrived up to north of the Caucasus or whatever, but it means practically nothing as it's open steppes, and so things are very decentralized and very agitated anyway. We are in 558-59. Even before actually the full settlement in the Carpathians, remember these are sort of all still different groups, and even surging leaders were not really capable of controlling everyone. After which they realized that it's the Balkans, so the Byzantine lands, to be the best sort of target in the moment. They launched raids into that. The various migrations, including the Slavic ones, had been destabilizing the frontiers that were basically untenable. And there is this very in-depth frontier of hundreds of kilometers across the Balkans where everything happens. There are still Byzantine garrisons in the greatest centers, but all around, so many people are passing through, even reaching North Africa, passing through the empire, and so on. By 568, the Avars that had negotiated with the Longobards all the migration issues, including the Longobards even managed to have the Avars promising that if the Italian migration had gone wrong, the Longobards could have come back to Pannonia. But we know how things went anyway, and it was better for the Longobards in particular, in this case for it. So the Avars control, that everything is rationalized in terms of political spheres of influence. Italy is something, the Pannonian plains another. There are very specific geographical barriers and also, more importantly, social-cultural ones. And so the Avars control this Kaganate stretching from the lower Danube, so also the Danube Delta, the Black Sea, to, in fact, further northeast of the Pontic Steppes. This is this corridor circling around the Carpathians that eventually opens into Ukraine, incorporating, in fact, Slavic groups all around, especially north of the Danube, who had recently entered the historical record, mostly through the Byzantines, of course, and is extracting tribute from the same imperial provinces as a hash money to prevent further devastations, loot, right, which the Byzantines, after all, were understandably paying. And it's completely normal. I mean, it happens still today. The notion that there are videos circulating on YouTube saying things, the Byzantine Empire fell because umpteenth reason why the Byzantine Empire fell. Never mind, reality being complex and being there no decisive factor, but they paid too much tribute. Oh yeah, because if you had been there, you would have unseated your sword and cut everybody to pieces, and the empire would also have lasted longer. Yeah, because we all know that a person in 2025 can easily manage the empire better than a 6th century Byzantine emperor. Well, that's absolutely notorious. In any case, this Avar empire was really impressive. It was the longest lasting steppe polity in Eastern Central Europe. The Huns are overrated, and the Avars are a bit more worrying. However, they endured only a couple of centuries, all in all, through also fluid alliances, tribute exaction, and military dominance, peaking with the failed, in fact, 626 siege of Constantinople alongside the Persian forces, after which internal fractures and Frankish-Bulgar incursions eroded its cohesion. If you're interested in Bulgar and Bulgarian history, just know that that's also something we have to talk a bit more about, but we already made something, and as you know, it's not like the Avars and the Bulgars liked each other very much. Contemporary Byzantine sources, beginning with Priscus the Rhetor in the 5th century, provide the earliest attestations of the Avar name, right? As we know, though, these likely refer to Eastern precursors rather than the Pannonian migrants. Priscus, writing in the 5th century, described events around 463 in the Don-Kuban Volga region post-Hunnic collapse. Right, so we are essentially between the Don River, and the Caspian Sea. And he tells us essentially the Sabirs, that, as you know, there is also this issue that lots of peoples, especially if you look at, the Russian Federation, and other, also post-Soviet states of Turks and so on, that there is this notion that the ethnonym, like this people is called like the ones that were documented 1,500 years ago, it's the same people. No. All right, that's mostly not the case, especially in an ethnogenetic sense, which was actually the norm in the steppes where things got watered down. But in many ways, there is an incredible, not just an incredibly complex, but also an incredibly miserable history of these peoples throughout, not just the steppes. Throughout this vast history of nomadic waves and so on, but also the later Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Union, etc. Like we essentially barely can track anything in terms of these were the actual descendants from those earlier groups. And we will, if anything, talk more and better about this. I partially addressed this about the Tatars that are originally intended to be Turkic, but they're probably a European people at large. But because of vicissitudes that you understand if you know a bit their history. In any case, the Sabirs, again, by this 5th century source, we're told, attacked the Sharagurs and Onogurs. These are Turks overall. Right, at least namely, driven in turn by these Avars fleeing what are defined as man-eating griffins from the ocean. This description is often like historians, they say, well, this is hyperbolic motive for Eastern threats, right? In this case, possibly alluding to the Rouran, proto-Turkic pressures of other kind. But the man-eating griffin is... from the ocean, in this sense, could really and properly mean the other side of Eurasian. So very close, the northeastern part from these peoples had originated. But the griffin, as you know, is a very specific symbol in tradition of properly transfiguring leader. It's a mix between essentially a chthonic and a Uranian creature that represents sacred royalty as the eternally rising and those who struggle in this place between this dimension between man and God. I discussed this in our videos about the Imperial Catholic tradition. And so he who can eat this guy is like, I eat heroes, angels, titans for breakfast. And so there's this idea of incredibly powerful leaders and warlords of the steppes. Now, and so these Eastern Avars, however, so the ones who would remain in Asia, differed markedly from their 6th century European counterparts, because even though, as we've seen, they had been, the European ones had called themselves after the original group, and in part, those were the actual Avars that mostly have seen dispersed even further east, like in Korea, etc., as refugees, like the Alans could do, in gold, something like that I also documented in other videos. They lacked, in fact, the Kaganate scale of power or Western trajectory that was also just the best. All these waves mostly succeeded in the measure they managed to expand west rather than east, right? Also because there was China, of course, in between, and some succeeded, as we've seen also in subduing parts of the kin, right? Everything laying under heaven, which was a big deal. We will come back more on that Chinese perspective. I have a series in which we talk not just about Chinese warfare during antiquity and the Middle Ages, but also the various peoples gravitated, the enemies and allies at the point of the same Chinese. And so we documented the Seljuks from the Chinese perspective, for example, other than discussing just, our one in the Western Eurasia. Menander Protector, who is a Byzantine author, were in the late 6th century, so more or less the time the Avars arrived in Europe, detailed Göktürk embassies to Constantinople, made a video about the Göktürks, especially about their warfare, not their overall history, but we can do it, can start, in fact, to substantiate, in fact, more this migration era series also with Turkic peoples. We're in 565-68, said that, these were Turkic envoys, furious over the Byzantine Avar alliances, because the Göktürks had hegemonized as oceanic rulers of the steppes, basically the entire Eurasian steppes, and this westernmost people escaped their control, and so they were quite angry of such boldness, and they derived, in fact, the Avars, which shows, however, how triggered they were, as varkonites, which is what Menander tells us. That is to say, escaped slaves numbering about 20,000, subject to their original dominion. So basically, considered them lesser people, which in a sense they were, because as we've seen, the Göktürks were by far the greatest power, were something incredible in terms of political cohesion. In part, they happened because of the exhaustion of the steppes, even after these Turkic waves. But of course, they had a very high sense of themselves, also a great self-awareness regarding the difference between them and the civilizations that they thought they could even hegemonize, at least in expectation. And these Avars, these Western Avars, were, just like the Eastern ones, basically refugees. They were just a broken people. And while they had maintained their own political cohesion, to some extent, they were the consequence of a break, right, of a disruption of this earlier Rouran Kaganate. This portmanteau likely fused var, that is war, that we intended before in Condic, Sionite, underscoring the confederative nature of the migrants, so that the actual Byzantine term nails the correct etymology of these people being essentially some bastards emerging from the agglutination of different scattered tribes. Theophylact of Simocatta, composing around 629, so just after the Turks and the Persians had been successfully repelled from the walls of Constantinople, preserved a purported triumph letter from the Turkic prince Turksantos, who had ruled basically between 580 and 599, boasting victories over the Hephthalites, or Abdali, the White Huns, whom he enslaved along the Avars, allegedly, then subdued the populous Oghur tribe along the Tildon River, whose leaders Var and Kunni, you see the Varkonites recur, lent their names to subgroups. Right. So a splinter of these Varkuni during Justinian's reign, 527-565, fled westward. These are our Avars, essentially adopting the Avar name to exploit, because of course, like Theophylact was talking about those previous times, so this would have basically tracked this Avar westward migration also across other perilous peoples, and that adopted the Avar name to exploit Scythian prestige for the most adept tribe. Remember, the Byzantines called these peoples Scythians in general because they thought that, also in a very Hellenic-minded fashion, that classical antiquity was perfect, and so if the Greeks called these people the Scuti, that they had to remain forever, and so that, I don't know, the later Franks were the Celts or something like that. In any case, fleeing Avars sought refuge in Taugast, 1,500 miles from Turkic lands, or with the Mokri, the Goguryeo, neighbors to Taugast. These would be basically the Koreans. I made some videos about medieval Korean warfare in particular. We're continuing that as well. We have to finish with the last chapter. The core group, however, went, or the ones that eventually maintained its cohesion, panicked by Barsil, Onogur, Sabir, and other Han nations, mistaking them for invincible Eastern Avars, accepted lavish gifts in exchange for this illusory protection. Thus, this is still before the West. This group arrived in the West. So again, there were other powerful core peoples that even abused them, right? Bullied them, and thus the pseudo-Avars, divided ancestrally between these Var and Kuni lineages, appropriated the name In the meanwhile, a misnomer Theophylact applied also to the Pannonian barbarians neighboring Europe and Pannonia, whose arrival predated the Emperor Maurice, as we've seen. A misnomer in at least the way he understood that, right? But there is always, we may never fully know how truly aware, especially, I don't know, not in this case Theophylact, but I don't know, Byzantine officials deputed to frontier international relations steps, migration affairs that had, especially in this time in history, an incredible skill and capacity, right? The Byzantines at this point were really sort of rocking, and especially in dealing with these peoples, they were quite expert and adept. Now, these accounts naturally are all, they serve propaganda at some point. This is not so important. The important is what we can filter through them. And as always, documentary history is very objective. It actually does render a pretty accurate and concrete picture. So Turks here would boast sole steppe hegemony by some degree. According to the Byzantines, and the Byzantines vilifying foes themselves during Maurice's Balkan campaigns, saying these Avars were basically beggars and, again, refugees and whatever, so they weren't really cool. But they all align with the fact that the Avars' ethno-genesis was substantially heterogeneous. Dobrovits and Nikaeva interpret the pseudo-Avar label as Turkic rhetoric, denying legitimacy to rivals, noting Apar in Kultigin and Bilge Kagan inscriptions and Armenian sources, such as Egishe, Vardapet, Gazar, Perpetsi, Sebeos, referencing Apar Shar, Khorasan as a Hephthalite-linked region, rendering Hua in Chinese as well. Yet, this Apar bears no direct tie to Pannonian Avars, seemingly, and Hephthalites, though confederative precursors, remained in Central South Asia without westward migration as well. So we don't know exactly how the name migrated. Dobrovits further suspects Theophylact's authenticity, suggesting borrowing from Menander to politically caricature the Avars amid the tensions with the Byzantine Empire, especially between the 90s and the beginning of the 6th and the beginning of the 7th century. Another important source of sort of Avar history, at least because it's unavoidably an external thing. The Avars did not develop enough. They had some runes and so on, but let's say they were largely literate. So we know about them mostly through other people's history. And the Longobards are a source of this because they bordered the Avars and also had their skirmishes, their issues with them on the northeastern frontier. We were just talking about this recently, not quite specifically about the Avars, but I made a video about the Longobard frontiers, especially the Alpine clausure. So what remained of also the Roman border frontier along the Alps during the Longobard era, which was actually a pretty civilized one, in fact, quite jarring with especially the Avar neighbors of the east. Paul the Diacon's 8th century history of the Longobards conflates the Avars with the Huns. This is very typical for a number of reasons that are also kind of obvious, right? These peoples were all very similar to one another, right? In fact, myself made entire videos, sometimes very specifically about what renders these peoples all different from one another, especially from a military point of view, archaeologically speaking, and so on. But at the same time, I also made some broader umbrella videos when it takes to say, well, how did basically all these peoples vote? The Avars, the Huns, the Bulgars, etc. These are essentially just Asiatic peoples, and they vote pretty much all in the same way. Also, you can realize that, for example, the Byzantines, while writing their tactical later on, they basically equated themselves, the Avars, the Magyars, because they fought all basically in the same way. All right. And in any case, Paul the Diacon's witness reflects the Longobard encounters and broader barbarian ethnonym fluidity as well, because of course the Avars did not inspire a particularly high sense of sort of ethnic cohesion. Even after they had established their Khaganate, that was quite powerful and quite extended. Again, today's video is not to explain how Avar power worked. I made a very specific video, which is the Pannonian Avars, the history of Turco-Mongol people, that I mentioned before. So you can find that. I have even an Avar history playlist already there for you that counts with this 6 videos, right? And it received some timid views, and again, I'm glad that at least we can talk about this. Now, such nomenclature dynamics, prestigious labels like Avar, Han, Bulgar, or Ugur variants, Kulturgurs, Utigurs, Onogurs, facilitate the steppe empire formation. Essentially, they reflect a universal worldview, the fact that there was some general idea of divine descendancy and ascendancy in the steppe, and that if you were, it's a bit like the Roman Empire later. I mean, everybody wanted to be the heir of the Roman Empire, so you had these ethnonyms that were specifically high-sounding and describing some particular qualities of the people, always obviously in a militaristic and religious fashion. And it was just a way to, and especially in the steppes, like to further unite groups after the very frequent disruptions that occurred at the passage of this or that other, and the perennially nomadic lives of these populations. In fact, what happens in Pannonian Plain is, generally speaking, they settled down. Also, they softened in that regard, and they melted away because they couldn't, as we explained before, maintain that older kind of profile. The Magyars are a bit different because they eventually sort of settled down. They're more, a bit more civilized. They had very strong contact with the Middle East before migrating. So Europe, they were also not quite originally from the steppes themselves. They mostly came from the forests of the Europe. And then again, we'll see that too. There are also different times. Migration era is very unforgiving, right? There are lots of, and especially these places are very poor. They will remain so. The greater wealth you can find is the loot accumulated by these steppes warlords, well entrenched in their, fortified, defended, sheltered in their fortified rings somewhere in the steppes. We don't even know where, actually, from archaeological point of view. It's just like Attila's court of Vienna. In the Nibelungen, they existed, right? But they're a bit like, later Viking settlements. Basically, when the Viking era ends, almost no settlement remains that had been founded at the time. In any case, defeated factions fled stronger overlords, bringing to this sense of, okay, well, we managed to escape, go far away, let's not turn back, because the nightmarish experience of those rules hit hard in a sense. And in this sense, you can understand how the Avars were winners, even from a steppe perspective. Like losing a Shina clan subordinate in the Western Turkic Kaganate west of the Dnieper River had, for example, done. Mixed components from prior politics elevated a Kagan for expansionistic claims. It was a great adventure and naturally a mark of strength, right? New identities unmoored from strict descent at some point, because there could be also adoptive processes and by these sworn brotherhoods of warriors, and equally done between, leaders and their subjects, garnered endorsement through success amid fluid agglomerations, essentially in the steppes. If you found the right ruler that survived for a long enough time only through succeeding, right? You could say, okay, well, that's the guy I want to follow, right? It's something that goes on and on and on in these people's history. It's just like, we've seen it very often in the series about the siege of Vienna. The Tatars all joining from God knows where, maybe even Central Asia, just like even the Seljuk armies in Syria, in Iraq against the Crusaders. Like it was known. Remember always, the steppes peoples knew much more about the civilized ones than vice versa, because they were desperately predatory. And so if news circulated, as they always do, that, an army is on the move, that's being prepared at least, you can easily cross even thousands of kilometers to join these raids and gather your miserable amount of loot, given that these, especially the subject is broken peoples, horse archers, people without any other wealth, literally move with everything they have. And to them, like, even that minimal amount of wealth means the world. Like the unspeakable level of traumatic misery and brutality of steppe lifestyle. It's something that no person today can quite properly come to acknowledge in a protracted sense, right? And even just in a mental, in a neurocognitive disposition, for not talking about an entirely psychophysical one. Now, archaeological evidence of, because here we're looking at the origins, right? So now we'll look at also, of course, the Pannonian Basin as the recipient of these various peoples and their genetic remains, corroborates this narrative. I mean, overall, thanks to history, because without history, we wouldn't know who would have been whom. Also because all these groups, as we've seen, were quite similar at large. We do have a pretty clear picture of the wall. Now, early Avar graves, we're talking late 6th, early 7th century in the Danube Interflu. This is, where it's basically between the Carpathians and the Danube, there is this Tisha River. It's in the uncivilized part. The Romans did not control that. It's where the Yazyges, the Sarmatians, wedged, right? Also during the Marcomannic Wars to create issues, trying to plunder the areas we remember before around Belgrade and so on. Very strategic area, however. And in fact, already the Gepids and the Longobards had settled, especially the Gepids on the Tisha, the Longobards on the Danube, from which they also launched attacks against one another, the sort of no man's land in between. Well, the Avars anchored themselves on this latitudinal feature. This was the Kaganate's core. In fact, it's also the most steppe-like place. So we're literally those older, say, clans controlling the establishment under the Kagan, etc., could perpetuate their steppe lifestyle, right? We've looked at medieval Hungarian history. Later on, we've seen how long-lasting and lingering the continuity of nomadic lifestyle goes on, chiefly because of the constant reinjection of different refugees from the steppes. Think about after the Mongols, the Kumans became probably an important part, almost a substitutive element for the royal army. We'll see better in the series about the Battle of Markfeld. But also because the environment was conducive to some sort of more equestrian steppe kind of life. So even now fully westernized Hungarian knights in the 13th century still rode with shorter stirrups. They had tendentially less armor. Like, there's some of that kind of stuff. Plus other interesting influences, including, the Byzantines battling against the Magyars in the 12th century tell us that, the Niketas Koniatas tell us that they had a chest plate armor for the horses, which is something more steppe-like that was not yet used in the West, even though not indicative of necessarily more general advancement of this military. If anything, it's more like what will remain also the leitmotif in Hungarian history, oligarchy. All right, just very few people are very rich, and the others that are basically weaker. This was true also for the Gepids living there, which also made them sensibly weaker to the Longobards, and instead had a much sort of more even wealth distribution among the Arimanni, and therefore made them a fiercer military, more cohesive people in arms. Naturally, when we look at also this Danube Interflu, given that, as we explained, that's where the Avar establishment had settled, we realize that we find there high status male burials, right? Especially if you look at the Boccia Cunaboni group. These date to after the siege of Constantinople, 626. with gold, silver decorated weapons, belts, insignia, for example. This is very interesting. Eagle-headed scepter, lunule, paralleling inner Asian aristocracy, because the eagle had always been there. The Indo-Europeans had spread that also far and wide, way before the Turks were around. So we see lots of very interesting things going on here. The prestige objects evincing Eurasian steppe types that persisted. It's not like the Avars were severed from the steppes after they settled in Pannonia. No, they left a trail of dominance as well. And in the wake of their passage were many other peoples that somehow maintained links with them, also to attentively get a place there. It was very convenient for the Avars. We have the best land here we have acquired in the west compared to the steppes. We have sort of richer neighbors to plunder. We decide who comes here or not, because we have the critical mass, we can decide, and we will essentially exert this level of control, of manipulation on you, scattered from the Carpathians to the Volga and likely beyond. We can never even say what's the actual frontier, for example, with the Gök Turks and so on. Reflex bows, sabers with seats, harness mountings, rings from Guinness, the cemetery, 6th to 7th century coins imitating Ravenna Heraclius mints, interestingly enough. So that was important for having their own precious metals circulating in a Central European economy and beyond. Because here, by the way, we'll explain now, of course, there was the Avars were not the majority of the people who inhabited the Pannonian basin. There were the Slavs, these other Romanized, also Germanic, I've seen it with the Gepids, the Iranians, other Turks, by the way, the relics of the Huns and so on. That were, however, subject to these peoples. That were really impressive, also from with their elite. Again, the Byzantines were quite impressed themselves by the Avar military capacities. A gold bowl from Albania, right? Today's Albania, on the Adriatic, dating to roughly the beginning of the 8th century. All signal elite continuity from Central Asia. The Transdisha, so basically the territory east of the Tisha, and so we will arrive to the Carpathians, Transylvania, burials, which constitute a secondary center. This was the shield from the east. It was a sort of mark. This would be the case for Hungary later, already sort of sub-enfeoffed, decentralized region, but well entrenched in and of itself. Features solitary/small grounds with partial complete animal sacrifices, ledge niche graves, and Byzantine-influenced jewelry from Pontic parallels suggesting Oghur immigrants. And so that fresher blood we're telling before in the more militarized frontier, whereas, I don't know, the Tisha area was like, the greatest civilization ever from a nomadic perspective in comparison, right? It's just like, I don't know, what happens in Persia. The northeast is less civilized. The Western Persians settle, as the establishment settled these desperates on the eastern frontier to get fresh subject peoples to send in meat grinder during their campaigns against, this case we've seen Constantinople as well. So there are lots of roundabouts. We can imagine, again, these knights of the steppes erring circularly, going back and forth. I mean, there's no place that they didn't cover at some point. They, at least individually, moving groups was a bit of another story. In fact, they could take centuries at a point. But say if you wanted to, again, cross immediately thousands of kilometers, you could easily do it. War bands would do it. It had always been going on, and during the migration, there was also the moment where some limits had fluidified, and so you could break through them at a point. Hiring opportunities, something like, or getting yourself killed in the process for that matter. Now, the Transdanubian, that is to say, instead, the western sides, like Kölked, show heterogeneous locals with Mediterranean Merovingian links. Obviously enough, Spathe, So more German-like looking sport. Not consider that the Slavs, especially in areas like today's Slovakia, etc., tend to enter properly like the Frankish sphere of influence, materially speaking, archaeologically speaking. We know that. We've seen it also in the video about medieval Hungarian warfare in the 11th century. Sax weapons, suspended belts, leg bindings reflecting autonomous communities rendering armed service of some kind to the Avars as subjects. So these are again our Germano-Slavic, so Celto-Roman, depends what had been left there, Turco-Iranian as well, but mostly sedentarized, stable. And for the rest, these guys look much more like the Franks, the Lombards, because they have the typical Germanic equipment. There is also a strong Byzantine influence, naturally, right? But it's not as intense, of course, like in the East and the Balkans. By the 8th century, uniform material culture emerged further, probably because things had begun to settle down also in a more internally interconnected fashion. It wasn't much just the single clan dealing with everything in terms of, arms and armor production, being on their own. There was probably more trade, more sort of sedentarized, probably more permanent infrastructure and international connection that provided with broader means to equip themselves, to supply their forces and so on. But also in this picture you have fading cultural distinctions, obviously enough signaling integrative Khaganate power. As we've seen in the video about the Avars in general, their general history, they basically after the siege of Constantinople, we know practically almost nothing from them. So this great power of the Avars at the end of the day sort of deflated pretty inexorably. Over 600 settlements and 100,000 burials have been appreciated, and they attest vast heterogeneity, especially in early phases, with raw grave cemeteries, full dress inhumations, and equestrian gears. We've seen some of these people carried out equine sacrifices. They buried their people in arms. I made some videos about, if you look at the roots of medieval chivalry, there's a playlist probably about medieval knighthood. We also dig a bit in this prehistory, basically, and there is so much about this steppes influence that transcend also a specific ethnicity. They were there for quite a long time, even among European peoples that had been sedentarized for millennia, basically. Anthropological analysis reinforced the fact that the Avars were fundamentally a mix of some sort. Mid-20th century studies by Paul Liptak on 7th century remains noted mostly Europoid, which is vague naturally, so Caucasian features, with steppe grave goods, while 8th century late Avar graves included 1/3 East Asian or Eurasian, so basically mixed East Asian European traits. 79% of Danube Tisha population showed Europoid characteristics, though the terms like Mongoloid, that is probably Northeast Asian, Turanid mixed, are at least considered by some obsolete. I will not pronounce myself sort of this ethno-anthropological, this configurations, etc. More or less they're less politically correct, but of course on Schwabbank we don't give a damn about that. Of course they're not so categorically strict, but they kind of overlap with general human types, appearance, and in fact genetic background as well. Theories posit a Tungu-type ruling class of sort akin to Tungusic speakers. So we're far, in the northeast. The Stuttgart Psalter, that is a notorious Carolingian manuscript, depicts, I often use, in fact, the same image, mounted archers riding backwards. And some say, you see, the Carolingians had crushed the Avars, so those are Avars. Yeah, there is this stereotype that remains. Like I was just collecting today images for videos on, was like the Italian Renaissance and whatever. And when there are biblical scenes, when you look at Easterners, they are dress like like contemporary Muslims, Turks, whatever. But the point, and I want to make a video about that, is that there actually were horse archers in the West, and way more than we normally think. So definitely in this highly sort of symbolical depictions, the horse archer is a bit the scoundrel of the situation. It's the lesser element. It's not like the knight in shiny armor, etc. So yes, Eastern influences, but it's not like it's the Avar. It's just a photograph of the Avar. It can be, but it also doesn't matter too much. Archaeogenetic data is, in this sense, more stringent. And there are different ones. Integrating over 1,000 ancient genomes from the Carpathian basin, for example, this study has been carried out on finds that date between the 4th and 11th century. So it encompasses the entire sort of migration era, the Magyar settlement, and so on. Well, it does illuminate this complexity because there is a way to date naturally through some indicators, the various sub-eras. So there are the pre-Avar baselines, so say the first 500 years, common era, comprising Roman Sarmatian west of the Danube, Hunnic overlays that unsurprisingly spawn around 400 to 455 AD, with Germanic, Goths and Gepids, and further Sarmatian elements east, right? So this is perfectly what matches our political, say, ethnographical history of the region. Late Sarmatian and Hunnic individuals clustered near Iron Age or Carpathian Pontic steppe groups, shifting towards the Longobards, 6th century, together with this, in fact, more southern and northern European clients. Genome-wide data from 66 individuals, 17 pre-Avar, 49 Avar period, yielded median 2.9 per coverage on 1.24 million SNPs. So low contamination, something lower than 1 to 3%, and clear damage pattern. SNPs is a specific genetic term. It means single nucleotide polymorphism that basically it applies also to, genetics, bioinformatics, for the way this stuff is statistically calculated, is a germline substitution of essentially a single nucleotide at a specific position in the genome. Right here, I don't want to enter into fields that I'm not familiar with. Just let's see what the results are more concretely. So our period genomes exhibit stark variability, spanning west to northeast Eurasian clients on principal component analytics, right? With substructure by geography and status. The Danube Tisha elites, 25 individuals, 8 high status post 626, form a tighter cluster with 88 to 98% ancient Northeast Asian ancestry. This is clamorous because it's here, right? This was the actual ruling class, and the guys who would have just waged war against Constantinople would have led this other populations who will see now they ruled over, right? So these are proxied by 50 to 250 AD Amur River Xianbei, right? So we are in Mongolia. This was the Xianbei were yet another confederacy, essentially northwest of China, and that quite eloquently connects genetically the Avars with the Rouran as well, that basically occupy the same places. The ancient Northeast Asian element derives from pre-Bronze Age Mongolian profiles, predictably enough. Could be specifically Fofonovo, Central Mongolia, 87% ancient Northeast Asian, and at 17% ancient North Eurasian. All right, so of course there was a significant mix, and you would have found also Indo-Europeans in that sense, but it's dominantly like a Mongolian profile. This was shared, by the way, with the Xiongnu. We still haven't talked about probably the same ethnogenetic origins of the Huns, but we'll get there a bit like the thing. So we're talking 3rd century BC, 1st century AD Mongolian plateau. The clusters are heterogeneous for that matter. Xianbei, 1st, 3rd century AD, Amur Altai is also similar, and a 6th century Rouran individual as well. That really, again, is very similar to these finds on the Danube Tisha area. Early Middle Avar elites in the same area. So we're talking the lower rank in society, in warfare, preserve 90%, early 7th century, 90% ancient Northeast Asian, right? Clustering with Mongolic, Tungusic, Nivk speakers, so peoples like the Buryats, the Kamnigans, Negidals, Nanai, Ulki, Nivsks. Late elites shift to a 70-80%, which is still crushing, ancient Northeastern Asian, the same place, so very central, where probably the bulk of the Avar Khaganate was, plus 20 to 30% Western sources, preferring non-local steppe North Caucasus proxies. So, like 7th century North Caucasus, 4th century Konir, Tob, southern Kazakhstan, over Carpathian locals. This is fascinating because it suggests continued inflows or admixtures with lower status arrivals. In other words, this elite in the Danube Tisha area not just retained crushing ancient Northeast Asian generic heritage, but essentially mated with peoples arriving from the Caucasus, from Kazakhstan. So basically, as we've seen, as far as the Avar Khaganate stretch, and this is also quite fascinating because historically, steppes waves happen from the core areas of the bowels of Central Asia. So those were the most warlike peoples that normally took over the ones in between. So the less gentrified, so the more warlike that had made it. And so these guys settled in and they married, right? They exchanged each other's daughters, and they preferred these to local women that, at least officially, like then the sexual conduct, if you read still high medieval Hungary in a namely Christianized situation, there are still laws like you should not kidnap women. If you kidnap a woman, you should marry her. This kind of typical steppe mentality of life. You go around and you just take away on horseback, a good-looking female peasant, but aristocratically wise. So what would have been better preserved, of course, as corpses in the tombs, were these other Asiatic women, right? So this is extremely interesting because, again, we get a lot of ancient Northeast Asian plus 20-30% Western Eurasia, but still basically steppes, right? Now, at mixture dates, dates align. In fact, early Middle Ages, 1st century BC, Ruran compatible. Late End Ruran, early Avar, late 6th century. No inbreeding signals, except one, which is also interesting. High mtDNA diversity and uniform N1A1A1A1A3A F4 205 Y chromosomes. The F4 205 is prevalent in the Mongolian Duk at 52.2%. No wonder it was ancient Northeast Asian in genome. Among 20 the Danube Tisha males, indicating patrilocality as well, endogamy, female exogamy, preventing bottlenecks. Both sexes migrated from East Asia anyway, as we just described. Transtisha group. This comes from, naturally, these are relatively limited samples, right? So, as significant as they are, and generally speaking, even these samples are unlikely to be particularly skewed by, some random factor, like the concentrated group or another. This other Transtisha group, 1217 examples shows more than 50% ancient Northeast Asian. In 7, mostly elite, with all admixtures dating matches with the Danube Tisha. Others negligible ancient Northeast Asian. Some Mediterranean shifted. For example, Sicilian Maltese affinity. God knows why. And again, these models are roughly based on also genetic similarity, right? So here we can think, I believe it's something relatively Mediterranean in general. Scholad, South 6th century models, in this case, revealed them. Variable dates, 1st century AD, or even more recent, imply layered Eastern ties, possibly Hunnic era ones. Colchid elites diverged. Female fully local pre-Avar. Male 20% ancient Northeast Asian plus 80% North Caucasus Iranian. Tajik North Ossetian affinity. These guys, especially the latter, would be Alanians, likely. 5th century admixture. So it's exactly, in fact, the moment at which the Huns had arrived. And so Tajikistan plus North Ossetia similarity. This is incredibly interesting because Kolkad, as we explained, is the westernmost part. And so we get actually much less Northeast Asian ancestry, but we get more Caucasian, right? Iranian. This is normal, again, because there is a very specific boundary between the settlement. You can almost pinpoint that, right, of this Turco-Mongol elite in probably the steppes areas, and the surroundings are populated by other peoples. But it's remarkable here that we get still, these are Avar tombs that we can easily sort of associate, as we've seen, to some fundamentally aristocratic nobiliary level that had included in this fringe the peoples like the Alans, together with other Turks and whatever. So this was a bit more of a fringe area from the mentality of this Northeast Asian people establishment, but they still were recognized as some sort of viable. It's like the Huns that liked the Ostrogoths so much, right? That kind of mentality. But still, at a certain distance. Non-elite Avars have less than 40% ancient Northeast Asian, and derive majorly from pre-Avar locals. So we understand here they're basically normal burials of people who were affluent enough, maybe they were farmers or something. They participated to the Avar army in some way, but they were not Avars. Or at least they had, here you see that as partly elite, some of them, less than 40% ancient Northeast Asian, can still be very strong. With a unidirectional inflow from immigrants dating, in fact, also from other steppes peoples rather than anything, because at that point, as we've seen, if you came from the steppe, you were considered more than the local descendants, right? And these date mostly to early Avar or Hunnic period as well, so maybe slightly earlier, 5th century. Broader analysis, 143 Avars, elites / commoners confirm ancient Northeast Asian paternal/maternal origins for the elites with N1A F4 205 dominant alongside, by the way, so that is very Mongol, alongside Q1A2A1, R1A Z94, so this basically hits Hunnic Iranian in local haplogroups. Autosomally, elites 90% pre-Bronze Age Mongolian, ancient Northeast Asian, sharing deep ancestry with Huns. But they are segregated in cemeteries. Autosomally means occurring essentially on or transmitted by a chromosome other than one of the sex chromosome, right? And so in this sense, we realize that there is an important amount of people who retained that ancient Northeast Asian ancestry and having a lot in common, in fact, with previous groups, right, ethno-genetically, but still social-culturally discriminating against those who were there before. I mean, the Huns were the losers of the situation, and they had been, as we've seen here, ruled by part the Goths, the Lombards, the Gepids, and so on. That had, as you know, the famous Battle of Nedao had probably knocked them out. Speaking, however, of the general population, so here we have looked at the elites, de facto, the establishment, the nobility, the aristocracy, whatever you want to call it. What about the general population of the region? So, of course, the local core is European. Doesn't matter how the area was, how the populated was, how many of these peoples had arrived. The majority is still European. Minimal Northeast admixture, indicating, of course, an elite horse nomad dominance over the centuries, considering the fact that, as I say, those are all from Northeast Asia. There are, interestingly, later northeast/Saka increases via further steppe migrations of substructure. This can be explained through further, in European ancestry arriving through different groups here. Let's not digress too much. Say we look at the periphery, we have 222 remains dating between the mid-7th and the beginning of the 9th century in Leobersdorf/Mödling in Austria. So this is also even relatively, it's not even that peripheral either, and we see that there is a shared culture in general, but divergent ancestries, right? Leobersdorf presents mostly East Asian elite, non-elite via endogamous partner selection. Mödling is more European. The males in Leobersdorf are primarily CM217, minority OM175R1A. Mödling has heterogeneous locals, minority CM217/N1A. After 200 years, the East Asian dominance persisted among Avars until Frankish assimilation. Consider that there is the Ostsiedlung as well. There are the Slavs also. After the Carolingian destruction of the Avar Kaganate, sort of breathing a bit once again, we have seen again the Pannonian Slavs. We've seen the Great Moravia at Similia. Right. Eventually, the Magyars arrived. So there were those two happy generations in between the Avars and the Hungars. But let's say. Then we have a last prince of the Avars in 822 mentioned, and this picture is non-Asians fully acculturated material culture is indistinguishable at this point. Mitochondrial DNA from 7th to 9th century Carpathian burials show mostly European, HKTU 85%, 15% Asian, interesting enough, CM6, D4C1, F1A, akin to Eastern, Southeastern Europeans. Now, this is very interesting because it still shows a consistent amount of course, of Asian ancestry, but it's not specifically Northeast Asian, right? So it's relatively negligible. Consider that, of cours, during the migration era and before, there had been lots of peoples from Asia that had arrived there. 62, 8th, 9th century Avaro-Slavic finds, specifically the Cifar Pact in Slovakia, present 93% West Eurasian mitochondrial DNA, 6% East, Consider that Slovakia will keep receiving hordes, including the Kumans, etc. So there is also an important degree of that. You can even just phenotypically, hazard with that. But let's say higher is than modern Europeans, but lower than other Avars, right? So this area already at the time was specifically kind of characterized by some higher, of course, level of Asian influence, but not as much, of course, as the core of the Avar settlement. Slavic-like evidence suggests specifically Avar male-Slavic female intermarriage. And so, of course, also down the social ladder, of course, like a lot of interbreeding, especially by the conquerors with Slavic women in more or less, consensual fashion, but that's not really much. There's not really much of a difference in 7th century Slovakia, not even among the Slavs. Now, we find 14 Avar males, early 11 and 1A, 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 1A3, 4 and 1A, 1A, 1 A2, R1, A1, A1, B2A, 2, C2, G2A, I1, all dark eyes, hair. All right, these 14 Avar males are primarily East Asian. Then you have in the Middle Late period 3, C2, and 1A, and 1A, 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 A3, E1, B1, B1, A1, B1A, Northeast Siberian, Buryat, Y apple groups. Again, 26th, 7th century elite as well presents East Asian mitochondrial DNA, Y DNA, and M231/Q M242 homogeneous, patrilineal endogamy, male-female migration. Xiongnu parallels shared N1A/Q1A/R1AZ94/R1AZ2124 Y/mitochondrial DNA haplotypes descending from Scytho-Siberians. All right. Now, there is a study by Savelyev and Young dating to 2020, positing initial Avars from Central Asian ethno-linguistic mix of essentially Iranian, Ugrians, Oghur Turks, Rouran. East Asian archaeological elements are limited early in times alongside West Asian, Caucasus, Southern Russian, Steppe, Central European traces. There are 22 studies, cell current biology affirming that ancient Northeast Asian elite origins is there, the Rouran affinity, Mongolic, Tungusic, Niv ties. An older study of 2002 by Eshak and Silic emphasized heterogeneity, mostly Oghuric, Turkic, Mongolic, with some later Germano-Slavic assimilation. Mostly, as we've seen, we think that happened, especially after the Carolingian conquest. Because at that point, probably the Avar structure would have been destroyed. It's also that endogamic practice that we were talking about before would have collapsed to some extent. At some point, we will see also this as far as the Magyars were concerned, because today we don't talk about it, but of course, the Magyars in part, co-opted some Avar that had been living there, just like the Avars had co-opted some Han, as we've seen. But there was an important difference. Now, in general, the exact origins of, at least if we look at the 2002 study, of course, all these peoples, that's also why I haven't become an ethno-genesis, right? Because it's frustrating of a job, frankly. But all this is based on similarity, right? And I'm not even trying to enter into the depths of this, but it's not like peoples have a label on them, right? Not even genes have in that regard. Politics is something else. Culture is something else. Identity, whatever. They actually overlap more often than not in the ancient world, especially when you have to stick, of course, to some kind of cohesion that does really pass through blood, right? That is very important. But for the steppes, it becomes basically impossible to untangle, considering that we know very few about properly the spatial and temporal dimension of these movements. So these people's exact origins are declared as unknown in the 2002 studies, but they are indicated as likely Turkic Oghuric in core. Golden, another author suggests Turkic Oghur roots. Pulley Blank equates Avar to Chinese Wuhan, interestingly enough, which again tells you how also, of course, China has a very deep frontier that had historically been infiltrated by the Turco-Mongols for a while, and we know it well, but it's still meaningful that there are these kind of possible swings. Others say that basically there are Tungusic elements. Increasing evidence links, however, the Pannonian elite to Rouran via Para-Mongolic, that is to say, Serbi-Avar language sister to Mongolic, right? So we're talking Pannonian elite, of course, we're talking the Avars here, because they also literally decapitated anyone else who was there, including the Gepids, as we see. Now, interestingly enough, you see that we don't find, I don't know, surely there would have been some Gepidic ruler that in a way would have come to mix his genes with ours, but in general, right, we notice this very strong ethnic cohesion and closeness properly to any foreigner, closeness, being close to any foreign mix, given that it was probably a completely different lifestyle, appearance, language, mindset, understanding. That is very clear, as we've seen for the finds, especially probably the higher elite, that still, even when sort of descending to the ranks, you see that they prefer to marry with steppes elements than the locals. While, of course, raping, whatever, in fact, it's quite interesting that the general population also displays some significant Asian influence. Our identity hinged on political institutions. Rebels/fugitives deemed Bulgars, for example, identify vanishing post-9th century. There are all these neighboring populations also share some similarities in the way they would have also contacted one another across boundaries. There is no identifiably sort of point zero ethnogenesis time or place, right? There is a constant mobility that eventually had these people born out of, the flux of others, right? And the Pannonian Avars would have been these Varkonites, described also by the Byzantine sources, blending the Vark Sionite. The Ephthalites are not there, so it seems that they didn't have any meaningful influence on the Avars, regardless of the connection that was suggested by some Byzantine source before. There are different hypotheses naturally trying to link up, especially like the political dots here. Guinea, back in the 18th century, was a famous Orientalist, linked early time these two groups via Tardan's letter and Chinese records, but Harmata rejected that due to half-century mismatch, right? Balint stresses nonlinear step ethnogenesis. This narrative integrates, of course, like all the general textual, archaeological, and genetical strands. A Ruran elite core, so of Proto-Mongolic identity, fling Turkic hegemony, fused with the Wark Sionite Oghur elements in the Aral Pontic zones, adopting Avar prestige amid Hunnic vacuums as an ethnonym, and to dominate a heterogeneous basin via endogamous dominance and admixture, yielding a Kaganate of profound Eurasian impact. This is more or less the picture. I hope it clarifies also, because people for some reason go crazy for this stuff. I don't know how or why, but my most watched video that is still watched today, inexplicably, after all the much better ones that I've done during the years. YouTube's weird, that old weird video about the Magyars, the Avars, the Slavs, the Bulgars, whatever. So at some point, it's not like, as you understand, it took my time to make a video specifically on this stuff. But if you're interested, we can deepen a bit more this archeogenetic aspect. I've never really been a fan of them, but as you see, in fact, as you see, they tell us what we already know from general history. That is, at the end of the day, the only reason why we're even talking about them. Because what do we know about Steppe peoples if we don't know their history back in it doesn't make much sense, right? So, in general, this corroborates what we already know. It adds some other interesting detail, which, by the way, shows how, peoples do mix, but only in particular circumstances. And that, for example, like the elite identity of these peoples was very much grimly preserved in a very austere and autocratic fashion, until in fact the system collapsed, which probably had to do also with that the system did not manage to evolve into something more sedentarily appealable, co-opting more elements from the local elites. It was crushed just out of the weakness of this oligarchic structure. The Franks crushing that, and generally speaking, showing how relatively unscary these people had become, at least by the end of their time, which is just 200 years after they had settled. Right? We will talk more also about the siege of Constantinople, because that illustrates how, of course, without the Sasanians, the Avars would have not attempted that enterprise from their European side. However, it also shows how much in contact with these other peoples they actually were. So that, for example, regardless of various mixing across the sort of Western Eurasia, there still was a pretty intense contact and shared influence. For example, the Sino-Avar trebuchet. It's apparently something that would dominate for centuries. The Byzantines took that also different. I made a video about literally the video about the Byzantine tents of the 6th century, dramatically owing to the Avars and their quite ingenious sort of tradition of camping outside, in the steppes, also during military expeditions, violent hunts at Similia. Of course, these guys would have looked pretty intimidating. Don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it's also civilization that decides the strongest, and we know how things fundamentally went. It's really important to appreciate the impact that these peoples had on the land, anyway, because as we've seen also, genetically speaking, they were not irrelevant, right? They were, compared to the larger population, of course, minority, but it still had they left some trace, and this all contributed also to the local genetics. Now, for today, however, I stop it here. We'll talk more about the Avars. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.